my presentations on these issues before, obviously. And is this showing up in the PowerPoint screen, or is it as if it was a presentation that I can't again see my screen? So I'm not sure what you all are seeing.
It's showing up like a presentation.
Okay, so as if any of you have heard me give one of these presentations before, I always start off with a disclaimer, and I'm not sure why this isn't advancing in terms of on the screen here. There we go. And of course, this presentation is, as I say, is always intended for general information about North Carolina law. It's not intended to be individualized legal advice. I am the general counsel of the North Carolina Farm Bureau. I unfortunately cannot represent any of you in any of these matters in an individual capacity, but certainly hope this is helpful, and I'll entertain any questions that come along, of course, as we go through the presentation. So what I'd like to do today is go over, in general terms, the governor's emergency response authority, because I think that sets a general framework for what you're seeing. Then we'll talk about Executive Order 141, which is the Phase 2 order, or as the governor calls it, the Safer at Home order, and talk in depth about that because there's a lot going on in that document that I think will be helpful to you. And then if we have time, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the liability protections that the North Carolina General Assembly enacted recently that apply to essential businesses, and discuss that with you for a minute. And then finally, there is one other item for consideration that I want you all to think about as we go through this presentation. And of course, if you have any questions, fire away, and we'll take them as they come along the way here. Okay, well, let's get started then talking about the governor's executive authority. Under North Carolina law, in the general statutes, we have what is called the Emergency Management Act. It is a set of state statutes that in general authorize the governor and other state agencies, most notably the the public safety, the Department of Public Safety, and the State Emergency Management Division, to prepare, prevent, respond to, and recover from natural emergencies. We, of course, have a lot of experience with that in North Carolina, unfortunately, in the context of hurricanes. And so actually, our state, I think, has a reputation generally across the country as being pretty good at disaster response. But this is the law that the governor is using to carry out any kind of executive action with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. I'll also refer to that as the COVID-19 pandemic. So if I start flipping words around, don't hold that against me. We're all talking about the coronavirus as it stands. Other things in the statute that are interesting that I think you need to know about is the governor is authorized to reduce the vulnerability of people and property of the state to damage, injury, loss of life and property. And then they are also authorized to prepare for prompt and efficient care and treatment of threatened or affected persons. So this is where you get the kind of public health angle on this executive authority. And then most importantly, I think, with respect to at least our federal partners in the Trump administration, it provides for cooperation and coordination with federal, state, and even local agencies, as well as private organizations that may be interested in helping out with disaster relief. So that's the general, I guess you would say, framework of the governor's executive authority to address these particular issues. The act also authorizes the governor or the General Assembly with authority to declare states of emergency. And those states of emergencies expire. They'll, of course, set a period of time where the state of emergency begins. And then that state of emergency will expire when it is rescinded by the entity or authority that issued it. So if the governor authorizes or declares a state of emergency, the governor is the entity that has to pull that state of emergency back down. And so typically it's the governor who acts, because obviously getting the General Assembly together with 170 members is sometimes a trick. And certainly in a situation where you're trying to socially distance and protect individuals from contracting an unseen virus is a hard thing to do. And so in this case, obviously, the governor has acted, and we are operating under a state of emergency that was issued. I think it was either March 10th or March 17th. I'd have to go back and look at that exactly, but it's in that time frame. The governor has, therefore, under the statute, this is what I want you to know, very broad authority to act to protect the people of the state. And I think that is something that we all need to keep in mind as we're going through this process. That this is an emergency situation, and the governor, as chief executive of the state, has authority to act. And certainly that doesn't come without controversy. As you can imagine, there have been, or not as imagine, as you know, there have been a lot of, or not a lot, several lawsuits filed by different businesses. There was a successful lawsuit brought by a group of churches claiming that some of the governor's actions under this Emergency Management Act were unconstitutional, especially with respect to freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion clauses of the United States Constitution. So the governor's authority is still cribbed a little bit by those constitutional and statutory restrictions. The governor just doesn't get to do whatever he wants under these executive orders. But obviously there are, not everybody is in uniform lockstep with how the governor's handling this, which is, of course, understandable given all the many different issues that are at play here. Interestingly, also in this, and I think this is important for each of you as agritourism professionals, you need to also pay attention to what your local governments are doing, because they can also issue state of emergency declarations. Many local governments have done that, either towns or county governments, and they can do that either through their town councils or their county commissions, or if they have designated their mayors or county commission chairs, they can act as well. I know in New Hanover County, for example, the county commission there has authorized the chair of the county commission to take certain steps under this emergency declaration. So just the point here, and you'll see this a little bit later in the presentation as well, just pay attention to what your local government is doing as well, because their actions are also extremely important as you try to decide what you're going to do or how you're going to manage your business through this crisis. All right, so let's move on to the executive order. Executive Order 101 is the Phase 2 order. I think in my research last night, I found that there were at least 20, you'll see that later in a slide, but at least 20 executive orders have been issued since March 10th. And I have to say, as a lawyer, I can follow most stuff that's going on, but these things are all interlocking and they all refer back to each other. And so it is a challenge for sure. Even if you're an attorney who's had some experience in this field, it's hard to keep up with all that's being asked of you and all that's being done in these executive orders. I think to the governor's office's credit, they try their best to keep these things as tight as they can, but it's just the nature of issuing executive orders in these situations that it can be a little haphazard or appear haphazard in how it's all structured. So Executive Order 141 or the Phase 2 order, I may refer to it as both throughout the presentation. The governor refers to as the Safer at Home order, which is an obvious hint to folks to stay at home if they can. But that was issued on May 20th, and it took effect May 22nd at 5 p.m. And it's set to end at the moment on June 26th, depending on the conditions that we see in the public health world and in the business world at the time that we get to the end of this executive order. I think, obviously, the governor, made some statements yesterday relating to schools and some other things. They're going to be following the trend line on new cases relating to COVID-19, and I think in particular, the number of people in the population who are impacted by the virus. If that number starts to go up substantially, that is the percentage of the population who are contracting the virus goes up, I think you're going to see the governor be very cautious in how they move on to Phase 3. But in general, the idea behind Phase 2 was to open North Carolina up a little bit more following the stay-at-home order, which was issued in mid-March. But of course, as I noted earlier, that's not as much as some people had hoped. And so, of course, that's always going to be the case. But at least the governor is doing what he thinks is best in this context with this executive order. Now, whenever you read one of these executive orders, and I think this one is about 15 pages or so, the first, I think about 6 pages of the document, it may be 7, are all whereas clauses. And it can be the tendency of folks to just blow through those and not pay attention to them, but you need to read them, whether you want to or not, because they provide important information and the authority for the action that the executive is taking. And so it's important to note what is in there, because that will help shape your interpretation potentially of some of the actual provisions that are given legal effect in the document. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. And I'll point out a couple of the things that I saw in there that I thought were interesting. But again, as I noted, well, in the context of this executive order, the governor sets out the history of the COVID-19 pandemic and then lays out some scientific information about how the virus that causes COVID-19 can be transmitted. And then it identifies risks of contracting the virus and ways to avoid it. And so this is where we get the keep 6 feet apart from other people, avoid close contact for long periods of time, limit contact with other people, especially when indoors. And as you can see from those 3 points right there, that is the basic idea behind all that you see in this executive order. It's that you're trying to keep people distanced. You're trying to keep people moving in and out of whatever contacts they're having. You don't want to be spending long times in a room with another individual who's not a member of your family unless you can avoid it. And so the idea here is try to keep people moving, keep them distanced, and try to reduce the potential for that transmission. Now, the executive order also attempts to strike a balance between public health concerns, which we've been mainly focused on, and economic harm. I can't tell you, you all know better than I do, the harm that this virus and the response to it has had on your businesses and other businesses around the state. It is, I do not envy the governor. I do not envy the president. I don't envy lawmakers as they try to wrestle with these issues and these questions. But in any event, that's what they're trying their best to do, whether you agree with them on every point or not. Just recognize these folks are in a really difficult position. And what's interesting with respect to agriculture in the executive order, again, in those whereas clauses, there is a statement that, and it's on the screen, it is in the interest of the state of North Carolina to provide as many viable avenues as practical for North Carolina agricultural products to be consumed in state in order to avoid unnecessary waste in the production of food. And then it also notes that closing on-premises dining has had an impact on agricultural operations. I think that goes without saying. But the point is, there are statements in this document that refer to agriculture and refer to the issues that farmers and agribusinesses are having as they deal with this executive order. I know that the Department of Agriculture has been involved in having conversations with the governor's office. We, of course, at Farm Bureau have also been having conversations with them about these orders as they are developed to try to get input in so that the interests of farmers and agribusinesses are reflected in these documents. And again, as I said, Governor Cooper's issued more than 20 orders since March 10th when he declared the state of emergency, and those are listed, at least in citation, in the executive order as well. So let's get into the meat of the document. We've gotten through the whereas clauses. You've got a good idea of what that looks like. And so there are the next section of the phase, the executive order, phase 2 order, lays out some definitions, and 2 that are really, really important for you all to think about. And again, I'm not providing any legal advice here. I'm just laying out what the law says and providing you education about it. But I want you to pay attention to these terms. The term retail business, as you see, is any business in which customers enter into a space to purchase goods or services, including but not limited to grocery stores, convenience stores, large format retail stores. I guess that's like a Best Buy or a Walmart, pharmacies, banks, and ABC stores. So they didn't shut those down. But the idea here is this is a very broad definition. I can say at the North Carolina Farm Bureau, as you all know, we operate a mutual insurance company, and we have considered ourselves to be a retail business under that order in an abundance of caution. We wanted to make sure that we were not in a position where we were outside the bounds of what the governor was intending when he was drafting this, or what we think he was intending, and that was as many businesses as possible that are engaged in selling goods or services should fall under this definition. So, but I noted that word "a space," which suggests some kind of building or place that people enter and leave from. So just, I know in agritourism, you guys are a little bit different. And so just note that term, and that would be an issue that if you had questions about, you need to talk to an attorney who can represent you, because that's an issue that I think you would need counsel on. But it's there in the statute. I wanted to note it for you. The next thing, and the next most important, I would say, definition is this idea. It's called core signage, screening, and sanitary requirements. And you'll note that these requirements apply to, quote, establishments open to the public. So again, the way you can read this statute is the retail businesses are a subset of establishments open to the public. And I think that reading makes sense because you'll see retail businesses have specific requirements they have to follow, but everyone that is open to the public has to follow these core signage, screening, and sanitary requirements. And so going through those very quickly, you need to post an emergency occupancy notice. And that's essentially, without getting way down into the formula on how you calculate that, it's 50% of your fire code occupancy is generally the rule of thumb there. You need to post signs reminding attendees, customers, and employees or your independent contractors about social distancing. Those need to be posted around your business under this requirement. Then you need to request that people who don't have symptoms or who have with symptoms not to enter your property. One of the really hard things about this virus, at least what I've read from the scientific perspective, is that it can also be transmitted by people who don't have symptoms. And so but still, the idea is let's be as cautious as we can be. If you have someone who shows up who has a fever or has a serious cough or something like that, you can request, hey, don't come in here or don't come onto my property as a result of that. With respect to your employees, or I would argue even your independent contractors, if they are working on your farm or in your business for a good period of time, you need to conduct a daily symptom screening. And that is, it's not required that you take temperatures, although some places are doing that. It is required that you ask people how they're feeling. And there's a document on the DHHS, that's the Department of Health and Human Services website, that has a brief questionnaire where you're supposed to ask people some symptoms. Are you feeling well today? Have you been in contact with somebody who has been diagnosed with COVID-19? Those type of things are the questions you're supposed to ask there. If you have an employee who gets sick, you need to get rid of them, get them out of your facility. That doesn't mean fire them. It just means get them out. They need to leave immediately. And then you also need to be cleaning high-touch areas frequently. And so, for example, here at North Carolina Farm Bureau, although obviously we're in a bit different environment because it's an office place, we have one individual as part of the cleaning crew who goes around this office all day cleaning doorknobs, cleaning railings on stairwells, cleaning elevator keys, all that kind of stuff. And so that's what you have to do under this phase 2 order. So if you have a high traffic, high touch area, you need to be wiping it down with some kind of EPA approved cleaning agent as frequently as is possible. So again, as I noted earlier, the stay-at-home order, this safer at home order lifts the stay-at-home order. but it strongly encourages people to work from home to the greatest extent possible by their employer. That's probably not something that affects a lot of you, but it might in some cases. But if people can dial in on the internet and they can do video conferencing and telephone conferences, then and they can get their work done, then that's what would be encouraged. And note that there are times where this executive order doesn't say you're required to do something. It is you are strongly encouraged. That's the language it uses. It also provides what I would say are general recommendations to the public about how to promote social distancing and reduce transmission. We talked about some of these. Maintain 6 feet of distance, wear a face covering, carry hand sanitizer, use it frequently, wash your hands for 20 seconds. I sing happy birthday to myself twice when I do it. And then again, cleaning high touch surfaces, steering wheels, wallets, etc. And if you stay home, if you feel sick, stay home. But again, note that face covering issue is not required. So that's one of those things that I wanted to point out to you. Now, as I said earlier, there is a definition of retail businesses. Any business that falls into that environment or that definition, you have some requirements too. You need to limit the number of customers that are allowed to come into your facility. Again, that is, I think, the best rule of thumb is 50% of your fire capacity. You need to mark off 6 feet of space in lines at point of sale and other high traffic areas. I've seen that all over the place. Even this weekend, Stephanie, my wife, and I took our kids to the pool, took our kids to the beach, and there was a pool, which was a hit, right? And they had spaces marked off 6 feet from the entry point to the pool because they had a capacity requirement and they had 6 feet marked off. Now, there are specific requirements for pools. We're not going to get into that today, but I just wanted you to note that people are taking this pretty seriously, and there are 6 foot markers outside of all these places. And then they are also required to follow those core signage, screening, and sanitation requirements. And so again, we talked about those at the first place. And those are the requirements that fall onto your business if you have a retail business. So if you're selling goods and services in a store or something like that, you need to pay attention, I think, to this retail business provision. And then if you have a restaurant, I don't know how many of you do, but restaurants, of course, have been much in the news as the governor's first stay-at-home order shut down on-premises dining. You could obviously do takeout, but what's happened under this phase 2 order is restaurants have the same requirements as retail businesses. Again, limiting customers, marking off 6 feet of sale of space, etc. But they have to arrange tables so that groups are 6 feet apart. That could be a major issue for a business that is designed, or a restaurant that is designed to turn over a number of tables during a day. And so this is a pretty big imposition on them to have to figure out how to manage that space and make sure everybody is 6 feet apart. That means if I'm on one side of the table and there's another table behind me, if you can imagine that kind of environment, there's got to be 6 feet of space between my back and the back of the person at the next table. There are incidentally in some frequently asked questions documents some charts on what that should look like. You're not allowed to have more than 10 people at a table, but you are allowed to have more than 10 people if it's people in the same household. In a household of 10 or more people, wow, that's a lot. At least in my opinion. Maybe I'm missing something, but that's one of the rules. And then it strongly encourages, again, but does not require workers to wear face coverings within 6 feet of another person. You're supposed to increase cleaning during peak times, disinfect shared objects after each use. And so that is an interesting rule of thumb there, or rule requirement for restaurants. Doesn't apply to others, but just restaurants. And then promote frequent hand washing, hand sanitizer for staff that's handling food. Anytime you're handling food or something that would be going to a customer, I think you need to be very cautious about making sure you're clean or your hands are clean, making sure you're disinfecting, all those type of things, even if you're not a restaurant. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So I know there were several questions submitted ahead of time relating to mass gatherings and weddings in particular. So let's cover some of that, try to knock out some of those questions here. Another huge definition in the document is the definition of mass gatherings. You can read it on the screen. I will read it to you as well. An event or convening that brings together more than 10 people indoors or more than 25 people outdoors at the same time in a single confined indoor or outdoor space. And then they give you a couple of examples, such as an auditorium, a stadium, arena, or meeting hall. I got a couple calls from some producers, farmers who run agritourism operations when the first stay-at-home order came into effect. Is a wedding venue covered under this? Y'all, a wedding venue sounds a whole lot like a meeting hall. And so I think you have to think very cautiously as you consider, what's happening with weddings and whether they would fall under this mass gathering rule. You'll also note that this term mass gatherings includes parades, fairs, festivals, anything where you're bringing large groups of people together again at the same time. Now, it does say in a confined indoor or outdoor space. So again, one of those, I've noted that for you. That's one of those areas. If you've got an attorney, you might want to talk to them about what confined means. But the idea here is, I think in general, it's a good rule of thumb. You stick to 10 people indoors, no more than 10 indoors, and you stick to no more than 25 outdoors. And that would be probably the safest bet for most operations. Also, a 25-person outdoor, the 25-person outdoor limit applies to gatherings at parks, beaches, or trails. I will tell you, at the beach I was at over the weekend, I'm not sure that people were following that 25-person outdoor limit, at least at one grouping in the beach that we were at. And then exceptions. There are exceptions. Retail businesses and other operations covered under the executive order or that are defined or regulated in a different way under the order, they're not subject to this mass gathering rule. And that makes sense, right? A restaurant is going to have more than 10 people indoors potentially. And so, again, the idea, though, is there are specific rules that govern these situations, so we don't need to apply the mass gathering rule to those entities. Also, gatherings for health and safety, to buy goods or services, for work, for receiving governmental services, normal operations at an airport, mall, shopping centers, grocery stores, those types of things are exempt from the mass gathering rule. And then, I know this came up, the exercise of First Amendment rights. There's been some discussion about protests and whether they are mass gatherings that should be prohibited under this rule. I think the answer to that is a court is going to be very, very reluctant to say that this order bars people from protesting. That is a core fundamental First Amendment right. As the Eastern District of North Carolina stated, worship services as well. Although there was a United States Supreme Court case dealing with California's law that said that that did not infringe on First Amendment rights. So in any event, First Amendment rights as a whole are not subject to these mass gatherings. So that gets a little bit squishy, but again, 10 people indoors, 25 outdoors, and that's the general rule that has been set out in this definition. So enforcement issues, those are all the rules, and we can obviously talk about that a little bit more. Enforcement is going to be by, I know there was a question about this, enforcement is going to be by state and local law enforcement, and there's been some news about that. There's a racetrack in Alamance County that has been gathering folks, and local law enforcement said, okay, that's fine. There was a big updo about churches a couple weeks ago, and some sheriffs saying they weren't going to enforce the law as to houses of worship. Violations, by the way, are Class 2 misdemeanors. The maximum penalty is up to 60 days in jail or a $1,000 fine. So, 60 days in jail is a pretty big penalty. $1,000 is a big penalty too. But this is not a felony. It's not a felony if you violate the executive order. Now, repeated issues, there are some statutes in the Emergency Management Act that might cover you there. I didn't research that in detail, but just assuming that multiple time offenders might be in a little bit more trouble than just somebody who makes one mistake. Also, the executive order, this is important, and I talked about this at the beginning. The executive order sets out minimum requirements for what can be done, and local governments are authorized to be more stringent than the executive orders. And so I know of one example. The town of Boone issued an executive order, or excuse me, an emergency declaration a couple of weeks ago requiring any employee inside a building, and we know this because of our Farm Bureau offices in the town of Boone, that you have to wear a covering at all times. And so that is way more stringent than what the state has required, but that was what the town decided they wanted to do. They also incidentally had a rule that was subsequently struck down by a court. But the rule was if you had resided for one night outside of the town of outside the county, Watauga County, you were not allowed to enter an establishment open to the public or a retail business under that version of the ordinance. Again, that was struck down. That's not a requirement in Boone anymore, but that's an example of where local governments may go a little bit farther than what the governor has set out in the executive order. So again, pay attention to what's happening in your local government as they deal with this issue as well. All right, so shifting gears to liability protections. And this is probably going to be a statement that might get me in trouble with some of my brethren in the plaintiff's bar. But there are some folks out there who will sue businesses if an employee or customer or family member of a customer or employee gets claims that they were infected with COVID-19 while doing business at the business. And so the legislature, at the request of numerous business groups, including North Carolina Farm Bureau, enacted Session Law 20-3. It was Senate Bill 704, and Section 414A of that bill provided that any essential businesses would have immunity from civil suits if a customer or employee sustains an injury or death alleged to be caused by COVID-19 while doing business with or while employed by the essential business. So a good protection there, but it is limited. It does not apply to a situation, and this makes sense, where a business is being grossly negligent, reckless in their actions, or intentionally trying to inflict harm on somebody. And it also doesn't preclude workers' compensation claims by employees against their employers. So it's not a foolproof liability protection, but it is something. When I say it's limited because the protections only apply from March 27th, 2020. That's the date that the stay-at-home order was issued. That's Executive Order 121, or I'm sorry, that is what we call the Essential Businesses Executive Order. And that applies until the rescission of the state emergency order. So that's that order back from March 10th, 2020. Remember, I said these were all kind of interlocking issues. It's sometimes hard to keep up with. But in any event, I wanted you to know that the Executive Order 121 declares that agriculture operations are, it says were on here, it should say are essential businesses. And you see what's listed here as an agricultural operation. It's a food and beverage manufacturing, production, processing, and cultivation activities, including, it says, farming, livestock, fishing, forestry, baking, and other production, agricultural, or excuse me, it should say agriculture, not agricultural, including cultivation, marketing, production, and distribution of animals and goods for compensation. It's a pretty broad definition. It doesn't say agritourism in there, I know, but just pay attention to that essential business provision, because obviously those liability protections in that statute would apply. Now, one other thing I want you to think about, I know there are all these rules in the executive order, especially Executive Order 141, the Phase 2 order. And although that order does not, by law, set a standard for a negligence action, right? And I don't know how many of you follow what negligence is, but a negligence claim is, the theory behind it is, you have a duty of care to an individual that you need to meet, and you need to do your best to meet that duty of care and protect them against a particular harm. And so obviously, with respect to negligence, the test is reasonableness. Were your activities reasonable under the circumstances? Did you reasonably try to meet your duty to the other person? I think we'd all concede that there is a duty to protect our customers and employees from contracting a pandemic virus, but there's also a lot of squish in there about what is reasonable. And so what might happen is if a business got sued, a plaintiff's attorney might turn to the governor's executive order and says, here's the standard that they needed to follow. And so by not following the standard, it doesn't mean you have to, but it just think through that issue again, consult your counsel about what you think you really, need to absolutely do. But if there are strong suggestions, give those some thought, because safer is always better than sorry, I would say. So at least some things to think about there with respect to those liability issues. I wanted to raise those for you. The other consideration, it should be consideration. I said considerations because I had a couple on my mind when I was working on this, but this morning I thought through this one. You need to pay attention also in your contracts to what's called force majeure clauses. These are act of God. You may have heard them called act of God clauses in your contracts. And at their core, these clauses can render valid contracts or contractual provisions in a contract unenforceable when unforeseen and uncontrollable events occur, right? So you have a pandemic that requires a government response to where a wedding venue, where you're going to have a wedding of 300 people, you can't have it at 300 people anymore. And so there are, of course, contracts that go all along with that wedding activity. And so there are some questions about whether your contracts have these force majeure clauses. It's part of law school that you learn and you never really paid much attention to, unless you had a hurricane or something like that here in North Carolina. But now everybody, and Farm Bureau counsel here in my office and on the Office of General Counsel, our attorneys are always focusing on these things now when we're reviewing contracts, because they now have a little bit more, I guess you would say, prescience in our mind. But note that also not all clauses are created equal. So if you've got one in there, you need to read it carefully. You might want to talk to your counsel who does your contract work to talk about thinking through how to deal with these situations in the future, because some vendors or some partners that you work with may try to enforce some penalties against you if you have to cancel contracts as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. I can't really speak to any kind of particular issues there, of course, because I don't have access to contracts and I couldn't give you legal advice anyway. But just if you have a minute after we get off the call, go check those out and maybe talk to your counsels about how you can deal with those issues going forward. Because the last point I'd make is this coronavirus pandemic is not going away. It is something that we're going to be dealing with for a while. These things are going to be important to think through. So with that, I'll take any questions. I don't need to share my screen anymore, I don't think, unless people want to go back. That's what I got. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see questions and other things that came in on the chat.
Thanks, Jake. So yeah, if anyone has any questions for Jake, you can put them in the chat. And Matt and I are in here looking at the chat. We can relay them to Jake. Also, we have some questions that were submitted in advance that Matt and I can share with you, Jake, if people aren't putting many in the chat.
Yeah, let's go ahead and Matt and Victoria kind of take a look at that. I know there was a long list of questions. Maybe consider some as a group. What were some of the common questions asked, so that we can maximize our time together.
So I see one in the chat now from Cheryl. She said, her festival is scheduled for Saturday, June 27th. When did you say the governor may declare phase 3?
So the executive order ends on the phase 2 order ends on June 26th. That is at least the date that was set out in that document as when there might be a phase 3 order coming into effect. But of course, I think the governor's practice has been about a week or so toward the end of an order, he'll make an announcement about what he's going to do with the next order. And so we've heard through the governor's office and other contacts that the phase 3 order might be a little ways off because of some issues we've seen recently as the phase 2 order kind of opened things up. And it may be I think I've heard people say a 2.5 type of situation. So a little bit more than what we have in phase 2, but not all the way to a phase 3. So again, note that the festival issue is pretty clearly addressed in phase 2. And so you might want to give some thought to talking about that and how it would affect a phase 3. That's really close to the line. But I obviously can't give legal advice on that point, but I can certainly say you should talk to your counsel and think about that.
So another question I've seen, Jake, is what do businesses need to implement for contact tracing?
So contact tracing is not something that's required under the executive orders. And my understanding of it is limited, but I think it's a situation in which you have somebody who has COVID-19 and you start basically interviewing them and asking them questions about where they got it, who they've been in contact with, and whatnot. And so you kind of move your way back through those questions as you deal with it. But you're not required to do contract tracing, at least is my understanding under this executive order.
Great, thank you. Another one I've seen is, what are legal implications to farms with agritourism? And the example they gave was some day camps are requiring parents to sign things saying that they won't sue. Should they be doing the same?
In general, those type of documents are helpful, but they don't mean that you're not going to get sued. And they don't necessarily get you through what's called a motion to dismiss phase or even a motion for summary judgment. So it is good evidence to have. It's a good practice to use those in general, but it's not a foolproof response to those type of things.
Great. Okay, so Matt, I'm wondering if you see any other questions in that document, or remember everyone, if you have something that you want Jake to cover, that a question that you want him to answer, you can put it in this chat.
So we have one in the chat. What about activities on farms like slides and jump pads? At what point might they be allowed to reopen?
That's a good question. I'd say you'd have to talk to somebody who's got contacts in the governor's office. Things like amusement parks and fair rides and things like that have all been prohibited thus far. I think it would also be, again, this would be a conversation you'd have to have with your counsel, but how you keep one of those things clean for people who are using them would be a big question. Remember, there's the idea that if we look back through the slide presentation, and I can go backwards just a second in my own notes, those core signage and screening requirements require you to clean, and this applies again to establishments open to the public. It requires you to clean high-touch areas. And so you need to think through what type of activities you're doing that are high-touch places where people are doing a lot of activities and places where people are congregating in general. Those are things you need to think through. It doesn't mean that you can't do a lot of the activities you've done in the past. You just have to be creative and rethink how you do that, given social distancing and those other requirements.
All right, any other questions you guys have?
Can you hear me? This is Vicky Porter. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, Vicky.
Hey, how you doing, Jake? I had a question that I sent to the forum, I guess, when I registered, but you haven't addressed it. And I know you're not going to be able to answer, but I'm going to say it anyway. Okay. We're struggling, as everyone is, but especially not knowing what the next phases will possibly look like. And I know the governor has the ultimate decision on numbers, but for those of us that are in the planning side of our business, as some of you know, we own wedding venues. Our brides are pressing us going forward. What will the numbers look like? And we have requested from the governor's office some input. We've got nothing back. So this is just a general question out there. It's difficult without knowing what the parameters of the uptick in numbers may look like, for instance, at the end of the summer or whatever. And it's tough when you've got brides' money and then we have no information moving forward where we're going to be. So any advice to how we move through that?
Yeah, I think obviously communicating, I know you guys have done this with the governor. As you all know, my colleague Paul Sherman's in frequent contact with the governor's office. We're obviously sharing those views with them. I think Senator Newton might want to know about that, Vicki. I'm sure you may have already told him about it, but those are the kind of questions that everybody's asking. We're asking them here too, in terms of, as you all know, Vicki's a county leader in Farm Bureau. When are we going to be able to do, what are we going to be able to do with county annual meetings? What are we going to be able to do with our large convention in December? Those are all questions everybody's asking, and there's not really a great answer right now, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
So Jake, sort of to piggyback off of Vicky's question, someone has asked in the chat, any thoughts on what schools will do for field trips? And again, they're struggling to plan for the fall with those. Any advice on how to plan for educational tours for schools?
Yeah, I don't have a great big crystal ball on that one. As the parent of a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old who's going to be going into kindergarten for the first time, we don't have a clue what's happening with our school or how we're coming back. So I know this really doesn't pass as a very good answer to the question, but I think it remains to be seen. And I think it's going to be that my guess is the school systems is total speculation, but school systems will start off very, very slow with just trying to get the basics of how a school day functions. I think they'll be pretty far off, at least in my view, on trying to figure out how you do a field trip and what that looks like.
Thanks, Jake. Someone else has asked, if we were to go to phase 3, what are the biggest differences? Any chance you know that, or is that something that, again, we'll just need to wait and see what the governor releases?
I think wait and see is right. I think what you would probably see is maybe an increase. I think I can speculate on this. I think you would see an increase on the number of businesses that would be able to operate. Obviously, right now, bowling alleys, gyms, places like that are, and I know gyms have filed a lawsuit as well. But those type of entertainment activities, we were talking earlier about jump houses and those type of things, slides. Maybe those things are loosened up a little bit. And I would also think there might be a corresponding increase in the mass gathering limits, depending on, especially for outdoor activities. I didn't say this when we were going through that part of it, but when you look at the 10 and 25 numbers, the reason 25 is larger is because apparently the science behind this virus is it does not transmit or is not as contagious in outdoor environments where you have plenty of circulation and air and things like that. So that's the reason why it's a little bit higher for outdoor activities. So you might see those go up, but I would not expect them to go up dramatically just because of, you know, the governor has, if he's shown anything throughout this process, and this is the way he's been throughout his career in public service, he's a very cautious individual. So he's not going to jump out and raise that number very high, in my opinion. Now, I could be wrong about that. I've been wrong before, as many of you on this call know, but I think he would proceed cautiously, and I don't know that that number will go up a great deal.
Thanks, Jake. Someone else said in the chat, this was Rachel. Thank you for sharing. Rachel said, I just finished student teaching, and from their staff meetings, field trips were not likely for the foreseeable future. Their school was hesitant for planning that for the fall, and that was a school in Johnston County. They did say that could just be with their school, but that had to do with students riding the buses. They're only allowed to ride one student per seat and skipping every other seat right now. Just to give you guys that from Rachel.
So we are narrowing in on our hour limit with this webinar, and just really appreciate everyone's involvement. And thank you so much, Jake, for sharing and unpacking phase 2 for us today, and for Victoria and Matt for managing the chat and the questions coming in, and for the questions that were posed ahead of time and those that were introduced in the chat today as well. I think what this means is, like Jake said, being as creative as possible with the activities that you are doing either on your farm or with your agribusiness. The outdoor activities, that's where our farms are centered. So maybe rethinking those things, and I wish that we all could look into the future and know more, but we are in a sea of unknowns. So we are here to help in any way that we can. So do reach out to our office, to myself, to Victoria, and we will help, guide, lean, help get your answers as quickly as we can and as thoroughly as we can. So thank you all for joining in. We hope that you will join again tomorrow when Marlise Taylor from Visit NC, the research analyst there, will talk about consumer sentiment. So where the consumer is on going and doing things, as well as some data to support it. So tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much for your involvement and engagement, and feel free to send us thoughts, suggestions for future webinars.